Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so glad that you are here. We are going to have a great conversation with one of our favorite podcasters, Bruce Carlson of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. One of our favorite podcasts. Reinhold, the first time I said, yeah, we're having Bruce on, he went, really? So he's been very excited about this, as have I. So Bruce, tell us a little bit about your podcast. Give us a little shameless self-promotion right off the gate here.
Will do.
Keep it under, like a minute, not 10 minutes,
I know you get some of these people, like I'm no good at self-promotion. No, I love talking about it. It is essentially history of the politics of today. So bringing context to today's politics and all of our issues. There's so many things happening now that when I started the podcast in 2006, which is very much when I started it, we've been doing it since then, trying to talk about historical stories. I'll often talk about things and wait for things to happen. I don't always do like today's issues, of the very today issue, every time. But usually they catch up. A couple of years ago, I did one on student loans, and I waited a while for it to come as an issue and then published it. So there's things like that.
We've had something very similar to that, where it's like we don't really need to do the migrant border crisis episode again. We just rerun the 2018 episode. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Why are young men committing violence? Let's pull out that episode. Yeah. So our back catalog is very similar in that respect when you cover current events. And it's like the Trump indictment stuff. We're not trying to be first. We haven't done the episode on it yet. We're trying to be good. Yes. And I think that, sometimes helps, but we're having you on. Reinhold, you're the one that set this up. What do you want to talk about, and why did you have the idea for this particular episode?
Well, a couple of reasons. One was the 6-part Fall of USSR series with the addendums added on at the end, which I really liked. I thought it was very enlightening, especially in today's time with what's going on with Ukraine, because I think a lot of what happens in that time frame, as Bruce explained very well, led to them going to a Putin, which then led to where we're at it now, and how Ukraine kind of played a part in the fall of Russia too, and how that all kind of plays through. And a lot of people, I think a lot of Americans just don't get a lot of the kind of the Russian society impact into what's going on. And we kind of try to put our own spin on things as we would see it, as if it were happening here. And I think this series really does a good job of highlighting that. And I just kind of wanted to hear more about how that comes about, and maybe what Bruce thinks about. What do you think about how that involves what's going on today?
Yeah, so we're not going to go super in depth because we want you to go listen to the show. I mean, obviously, how many total hours? Right?
It's about seven or 8 hours, so there'll be no way.
Yeah, it's sunny. It's like the first sunny spring day here, so we're not doing 7 hours today. But give us an idea of like what it took to produce 7 hours on the fall of Russia.
I mean, so this is a project that was started about 10 years ago in notebooks. And I can recall being on a flight in Atlanta, and the plane got, delayed, and we were on the tarmac. Thankfully, I finagled my way in first class, had a nice seat, but I was rewriting and copying from notebooks back then. And I just never got a chance to podcast it. And, listener, I remember talking to one of the listeners, like, you got to do it. I don't know. And so I spent most of last year doing kind of extra work. So to explain, like, My History Could Beat Up Your Politics, as we said, is kind of like the somewhat of the events happening now and a little bit of historical perspective. And so I'm doing a lot of quick topics. And so many years back, I decided, like, well, Bruce, if you keep doing this, it's almost like swimming against a really rough tide. You're going to get a little intellectually dumb if you don't take on some big topics and do those as well. Because all you're going to be doing is little snippets. And I do a lot of that, and you have to. But you can't go in depth if you're doing, say, like a weekly or bi-weekly podcast on just today's current events. So the Soviet Union was one of them. Ronald Reagan was another. I did very controversial president, but a very misunderstood as well. Did a series well back on that. Arc of Commerce, I did a series on business history because that's not been really done, especially by someone who's not a total, just pro-business point of view, looking at everything, and so those are the topics. And Soviet Union was up, and the fall of the Soviet Union in particular. But as we tell the story of the fall of the Soviet Union, which really happens amazingly for a system that has thousands of people in the Communist Party behind it, it's larger than the Saudi royal family. I think that's 2,000 people. This Communist Party is thousands of people. For it to fall in what turned out to be 3, or you could really say 4 days, safe to say the 4 days in 1991 is incredible and amazing. So as I tell the story of those 4 days, we're inserting the story of mostly the recent Soviet Union and the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. I kind of kept it there with a couple references to Stalin things, because how can you not talk about the Gulag and Stalin and Brezhnev and everything else? But we intersplice the story of the Soviet Union through the story of those 4 days. I mean, there's 2 episodes on day 1. So it was just the only way to do it, to have, I started trying to do an episode a day, and it's just too many events going on in Moscow streets and everything like that. And,
we tend to think of it as, a week-long event and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that's how but the Berlin Wall came, what was it, months or years before that? Like,
it was 89, so it was 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long process, but like, when we look at the root causes of why the Soviet Union crumbled, what are some of the first cracks? I've heard Gorbachev say Chernobyl was one of them. Reagan takes credit for the arms race. Like, what are some of those top line things that really led to the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I find it difficult, especially doing this, to attribute too much to that arms race. Indeed, it appears, I share the view of some scholars that every time we escalated the arms race, it seemed to give the Soviet conservatives, which they had, more of a leg up on people like Gorbachev than the other way around. And you have some of those actors, including Gorbachev himself, directly saying it. When the West fails to support Gorbachev and peace initiatives, that's one of the things that emboldens the Gang of Eight, the coup plotters, and Kryuchkov, who was the head of the KGB, probably being, I put him as the leader, but this is part of the problem of those week's events. Is no real leader. They're all a bunch of lieutenants, but he's probably the chief of the lieutenants in any case. But to go to the larger causes, yes. So terrible economy during this time. It's time to bury some macaroni. It's time to bury some bread. The types of things you hear on Moscow streets in 1990. Gorbachev launches these economic reforms, but the system isn't really ready for it. So you have immense shortage of supply, larger than people had remembered, even in the key communist Brezhnev times of the 70s, when oil economy was fueling the Soviet Union, which is part of the problem in the 80s as well, is that oil prices dropped. Well, the Soviet Union, as much as it says it hates the West, is financing its little system from oil revenues sold to foreign countries. And that's what makes the communist dream become possible to the extent it is in the 70s, to even fund like their social programs. That drops in the 1980s. Oil prices drop, and they're a producer. So that's a problem there. Gorbachev institutes a very foolish prohibition, really, really close to that. It's not an absolute prohibition, but you can only get vodka from the state stores, heavily taxed, big long lines. People are drinking all kinds of chemicals that they can find and selling. There's a huge black market for alcohol. But those taxes fund the Soviet Union government. So that's part of the problem, too. You're right, and Gorbachev's right to cite Chernobyl as the real television event that the government was lying to people. Oddly enough, it helps the leader of the government, Gorbachev, in a way, because he's introducing reforms. But if for a lot of people at the same time, they're also blaming Gorbachev, who lied in some cases about the response to Chernobyl and the magnitude of the disaster. And it's also the battles between liberals and conservatives that in releasing certain like Sakharov and certain human rights prisoners in the Soviet Union, and then them taking part, being people's deputies in releasing free speech, essentially.
Yeah, is it the Glasnost reforms? I mean, how you always
yeah.
I think those of us who are younger, I'm 39, so I barely remember the Soviet Union. I was alive during it, but I was like in first grade when it fell, right? So you don't have an understanding of the complexities of this. But, so people my age tend to think of the Soviet Union as North Korea, where it's very closed off, very shut down, total controlled society. I doubt that's probably true now that I'm a little older and wiser. But, there's the American myth or truth, I don't know, you tell me, that Glasnost and the opening of the economy, the opening of society, allowing in blue jeans and all that good stuff, American society infiltrating with rock and roll is what collapsed the Soviet Union. How much does that contribute to it?
I mean, look, what it is like many things in history, it's multivariate. We love to, in textbooks, to name one solution, Lincoln freed the slaves. These are the textbooks. It's not even really the history teacher or textbook's fault. They try, but it's how we remember things. One thing, but these problems are multivariate, and so it is with the Soviet Union. But there's a lot there in Glasnost. So with Glasnost, we think of that as openness or free speech as a translation, but the actual word is publicity. So it's perestroika's reform, and that's the economic part, and Glasnost is free speech, publicity. See, it's a top-down driven reform. So the idea was always in the Soviet leadership, which had a range of liberals and conservatives, reformers, kind of your Soviet, maybe a little bit earlier than baby boomer type people, children of the 60s, say, children of the 50s and 60s, who were, coming of age post-Stalin, had a lot of reform-minded. There were some reform movements that occurred in the early 70s that were kind of clamped down on by Brezhnev, and then there was Gorbachev comes to power as a kind of reformer, a little more establishment reformer, if you ask me. But so his idea is, and I always was, even going back to Andropov, who was the head of the KGB under Brezhnev and later briefly became leader of the Soviet Union, was that if people are free to speak, we can root out some corruption. The problem with the system's great. We just got to root out that corruption. There's people stealing. There's people shirking their duty. There's people that are drinking vodka or in the subway when they should be at work, in the factory. All we got to do is have publicity. And in another way, we might say this is eyes and ears, or the very American common, if you see something, say something. That's really what Glasnost sort of is. But like anything, it's a snowball and it starts expanding and expanding. And the KGB initially really supports Gorbachev's rise from a lot of what we see, and even perestroika and Glasnost. After all, Andropov had done some of this. In the 70s, there's a magazine called Argumenty and Fakti that's sort of released from its normal bounds, and people are talking. It's a kind of letters to the editor magazine. So you have a little elements of this, but Gorbachev accelerates it, and eventually you start having people criticizing Gorbachev and criticizing the KGB and criticizing the Soviet way of life. There's a famous champion weightlifter who was the 1960 Olympic champion from the Soviet Union, who kind of showed that communism could rule the world. He was a hero, and he speaks out on television as one of the people's deputy against the KGB, he calls Gorbachev a petty tyrant, and he also calls the government incompetent. And people are seeing these messages, and the system as it is, they're thinking it's going to improve the system, but that free speech really starts to erode it. Western genes, Western music, yeah, that's a part of it. A lot of that had started to come in, and it was unstoppable with transistor radios in the 60s and 70s, of genes very popular. It was also popular to make things that looked like Western genes. But, I heard a story of even something as simple as like a plastic bag from the West. Someone might covet that in Georgia or Armenia, or in the streets of Moscow, in the way we might treasure like something, a piece of jewelry or something. Just to have anything from the West was great. That may have not alone eroded things, but certainly it didn't. It probably didn't help from their perspective. I don't think that the Soviet Union, once you get away from the absolute Stalinist period, after Stalin dies, Khrushchev has a bit of a thaw, a bit of an opening in society. I don't think it ever was North Korea, particularly in the time period that I was focusing on, which is the late 70s and the 80s. I think you have more openness. I think particularly the younger generation is very there's a little bit of laughing at the society. There's a little bit, some of the, there's one, a lot of what I did in this podcast is pick up comments from Russians, either through novelists or like Henrik Smith, the journalist, I should say, who goes to Russia and picks up in the 70s and 90s and picks up interviews, or people writing on Quora, living in Russia today, talking about their times, or other people who had blogs. There are a couple of blogs I captured back in 2010 and had in my notebook that aren't on the internet anymore, which I thought was great. It's a piece of history now. People explaining how things were. And you hear things, you hear what people thought of Gorbachev, and usually not very much. He's admired in the West, not so much in Russia. And you hear a lot of other things and takes on it. But there was a lot more talking with a little bit. I think there's one older Russian who said, well, the young people know not to tickle the goose. There's a little bit of that. Like you had to watch. Think about it like being at work and you have HR, but the HR is more like the government. And they have, there's a first department in every factory. And that's really responsible to the government, not just like a corporate HR. And a lot of people are reporting things way more than, I don't know, in some companies. I think we probably feel like we have, the HR is like the KGB, but people are saying things about other workers and stuff. But think about that accelerated like 10 times.
Yeah. Have you seen Chernobyl on HBO?
I haven't seen the whole thing. Of course, I studied that issue a lot.
Yeah, it's a great show, but it just sort of shows the malintent of bureaucracy, whether intentional or unintentional, where it's cold and unfeeling, and we're just protecting our behinds, and we're afraid of the upper echelons of the government, and whereas Gorbachev wants to be told kind of what's going on, but not in the wrong way, right?
Well, when people started throwing eggs at him at the parade, when they did the victory parade in 1990, I think that's when he realized they could not even visit Lenin's tomb, which the leader of the Soviet Union would do every year. But there were protests in Moscow over the bread shortages. And that's where I think the moment where he starts to go a little rightward or wiggles a bit between left and right. And he's between the years 89 and 91, he's really in a kind of dance. I really think 89, the year that the Berlin Wall falls, is a much more important year to focus on, even though the coup happens in 1991.
Well, can I stop you there just to set it up so people have an understanding? Can you give us an idea of the structure of the Soviet Union? Who are some of the players and levels that you're talking about briefly? Mm-hmm. And then what happened with the Berlin Wall falling and the Warsaw Pact dissolving, which led to 1991? I think maybe some of that context, just for the people who I don't even know who Gorbachev is.
You're right.
What the heck are we talking about here?
Yeah, very important. Very important. So the Soviet Union is obviously from 1917 to 1991. It is a country. It is an enormous country because even though some people say, oh, that's Russia now. Well, no, Russia lost almost half its territory, if you look at it that way, with the loss of the whole Soviet Union. It was an enormous country, more population than anywhere, more size than anywhere. It stretched into the Central Asia, with republics like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and into the Baltic states like Estonia, and country that are now countries now. And they play a key part in the whole thing. So you got to think of this very large country. The leadership of the country is interesting, a little different than today, but think about it like this. If we only had the Democratic Party, all right, and somebody's cheering, somewhere somebody's vomiting right now when I say that. If we only had
someone's saying they're all the same anyways, and we have one state of singular control.
Someone's saying that, and that is actually a great way to think about the way the Soviet structure is, because you only have one party, and they abolished all parties upon the real completion of the Soviet project in the early 20s, when they had finished the revolution there, and brought in all the different socialist republics that were allegedly independent, like places like Kazakhstan, but really responsible to Moscow. So you have the leadership of the Communist Party as almost a government. You have the political leadership, which is certainly a government. So like the Politburo, this is the group that runs the country, and there's a Supreme Soviet.
And they did they go through sham elections to be like president of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, there were a lot of elections, not for president, so the president's appointed, but for all the deputies and all the positions. There actually were a lot of elections in Soviet Union, which strangely enough.
Did they have, like in Russia, I know it's a federation, right? So there's like states within Russia now. Did Russia specifically, because Russia and the Soviet Union are not the same thing. You know, you had all the satellite states within the Warsaw Pact. You had Russia. It was just the most dominant figure. But did Russia at that time even have governorships and like local elections all the way down too? And were those? I assume they were not open, free, and fair.
They weren't open in the sense that no one was running against people in the Soviet Union. There is an interesting thing that goes on. So, I mean, the answer to the question, though, is absolutely, they did have those things. They had the local, sometimes those people in the hinterlands and in Siberia and like that became little chiefdoms, little like in fact, it was really difficult for people like Gorbachev or even Putin when he first came to power to dislodge some of those very powerful local people who had their factories and their power base and things like that. But no, there would be, with one party, You there are a lot of elections in the Soviet Union, and you do have things like talks where people they have to like sit there and respond to voters and things like that. It's just if somebody gets too cranky, I've heard stories where, say, the late 70s and going into the 80s, where if people complain too much at some of these meetings, they might find that they've lost their job or lost their promotion. Something's in their characteristic file, you know. So it's not exactly as great as here, but they do have an interesting thing that happens is, you know how like on eBay or Uber, you have a rating system from like 1 to 5 or whatever it is, but you really with eBay it's like 100, but you really have to get super high. You're just not allowed to get anything low, and that was kind of happening in the Soviet Union. So if they did have a vote and somebody got a really low vote, they may not get nominated by the party again, because they still have to worry a little bit about popular opinion. But it's not like you had 3 different parties. They were approaching that right up to the point of the coup. That was getting to be a real thing. We're going to take away the Communist Party's dominant role or exclusive role in the government and open it up to some other parties. And the pressure for that was coming from left and right, who wanted reform, and also like more militaristic parties that would be more aligned with KGB and military and things like that. Because in some cases, they felt the communists were too liberal or reformist, you might say. So you have like a party government. You have the actual government. In the person of Mikhail Gorbachev, he holds that dual role. So he's general secretary of the Communist Party, and he's also the president at the time of the coup. At least they established the position of president of the Soviet Union. So he has those two things. It's also important to talk about in the Soviet Union that there's almost a third, and there's sort of a fourth and fifth to think about. And you brought up a sixth. So there's the local government, might be the sixth. The fifth might be the Supreme Soviet, which is kind of their Congress, and you might say Supreme Court all in one, and then there's the KGB and the secret police. So this is not just an incidental thing that like someone like a Gorbachev orders around, even though that they can. They have their independent political activities. They're really a structure of society that's supposed to be a little independent from the government in case something goes wrong. Someone described it as a time bomb within the Soviet structure. So they have all of these elements, including all the republic governments, but mostly up until the late 80s, those governments are pretty subservient to Moscow. And so even when people say, Russia's just one of the republics in the Soviet Union, it was very dominant. And ethnic Russians really were a big part of the government. Ukraine actually is part of the Soviet Union. That's important to say here, and very influential. Almost, a good number of the leaders, Khrushchev's one of them, come from Ukraine. So it was always very powerful, huge population, huge economy, and that's part of the conflict you're seeing today.
Yeah, that's part of why Holodomor happened in the 30s. It was it's the breadbasket of Europe. If you control the food supply, then you control a lot. I don't know. It just sounds really weird to me, Reinhold. So there's an overarching government that seems to control the lower governments largely through funding. There's a spying apparatus, and there's a one-party state. Amazing. It's just so different than us. Reinhold, go ahead. If you want to jump in here, I'd love for you to ask Bruce a question. Because I told Reinhold, I said, listen, I haven't listened. I know you've listened to all of them. I want you to lead the conversation. We're 27 minutes in, and Reinhold has not asked one yet, which is Bruce standard operating procedure here on the show.
SOP.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a couple things I was interested in, and I guess kind of at that point now, I'd like to talk about the coup attempt and its failure.
Who was getting couped, Reinhold?
So they were, as I understand it, they were taking the Soviet were trying to basically replace Yeltsin, and by saying that Gorbachev was sick and kind of take over, right? So they were trying to take over.
Yeah, well, the Soviet Union was about to develop something closer to the EU, where these republics would now be. This is after the Berlin Fall, after East Germany.
This is 91, right?
This is 91. There's the discussion started in 90 of let's get Yeltsin, Khrushchev, the Ukrainian leader, and I forget the name of the guy in Belarus at the time, but they're all interested in being. They're not yet for independence, so they're going to work out a deal with Gorbachev to form more like an EU, where they are going to have a lot more autonomy. And one of the key things is KGB now, under this new union union treaty they're going to sign, KGB becomes like closer to our FBI. Because, I mean, to your point, I know it always feels like there's this woman that I quote a lot, Evgenia Albats, who studied the KGB intensely. And she just stops talking to people who compare the FBI to the KGB. It's just the depth of integration with society, with the powers that they had, and the untouchableness of it was just so much. But they wanted to get it more like our FBI, where it's like, oh, it can do some things. It can surveil people and stuff, but you're going to be under our instruction as republics now, not this crazy independent thing that we don't even know what you're doing kind of thing. And that you want to have say over who's going to be the next president in our countries. No, we're not going to do that. So the more subservient KGB and just more autonomy. And he goes to Gorbachev, he's all under a lot of strain, and he wants to go to Crimea, where one of the president's palaces are. It's a really nice place. And in Foros, and they... At that time, he gets a visit on the door. He gets a visit from it's kind of late at night, and he gets approached by a security team, and they're like, Mr. President's been here to see you. Like, I'm the president and the general secretary of the Soviet Union. Like, nobody comes to see me. I didn't invite them. He's like, I'm sorry, you have to see them. They're our boss. And so they say, Mr. President, we want you to sign this, you hand over your power. He says, no, I won't be part of it. They blockade him, cut off his communications, goes to pick up the phone, can't pick up the phone. So now Gorbachev is not harmed physically yet, at least, but he is cut off. And then they blockade the airport. They blockade any communications. They blockade him physically and with his family. The family's pretty scared and concerned. They know what's happened in Soviet history before, even though the USSR is in what they call their vegetarian days. So that's the events. And then over in Moscow, there's a gang of 8 people, significant players in the Soviet system, including the head of the KGB, not surprisingly leading it, who are announced that they've formed a government. They've got the vice president. So they've got some form of constitutionality, but they're not really following the right procedure. And that's announced on a Monday morning.
What did Yeltsin play a role in that too?
No, Yeltsin was part of the was going to sign that union treaty along with Belarus and Ukraine, and they'd probably get most of the others along with it. But to form if they had those 3, they could essentially form a new union and still have Gorbachev as president of the Soviet Union, but a weaker Soviet Union. And a friendlier one for the West, likely. Go ahead.
Barricaded into his offices too, right?
Yeah, so he's at his dacha, which is his vacation house outside of Moscow, after he had been down in Kazakhstan organizing, and he's about to go back into Moscow, and then he learns of the coup. There are KGB at his dacha now for reasons that are still a mystery. And a lot of speculation and things like that, of course, just every aspect of the story. But for reasons that are still a mystery, I tend to think it's because the coup was, they didn't want bloodshed. And they figured they could control certain things. They also realized Yeltsin hates Gorbachev. They're rivals, even though they're both on the reform side, ostensibly. As I said earlier, Gorbachev's more your establishment reform, and Yeltsin's more rebellion and populist, and Gorbachev is not populist at this time. Most people dislike him. Some like him, really like in the city of Moscow, and people in government and stuff might like Gorbachev, but the overwhelming, Soviet citizenry, there's not high opinions. I have lots of quotes in my podcast about comparing him to an idiot and a Cossack and things, Don Cossack and things like that. But so Yeltsin is a mistake definitely made by the coup plotters. He is not detained. Now, he might have been and might have narrowly escaped, as we talk about in the podcast, but he decides to take his car and go into Moscow and go through what are hanging out like in the trees outside his dacha KGB agents and a larger force than the security he has. He tries to go to the Kremlin. He wants to meet with these guys. I mean, Yeltsin takes no prisoners, as we'll see later. He is a very brash. He was fighting like hell with Gorbachev. That may have, as I said, that may have been one of the reasons the coup plotters didn't think they had to lock him up, because they thought he might have delighted that Gorbachev was a prisoner essentially now and being removed. But they were mistaken in that. He wanted to talk to them. He called it illegal. He goes to the Russian White House, which is his place of business. And to your point earlier about these local republics, did they have a lot of power? That Russian White House building was essentially like a paper stamp, like a government. We might think the office of the treasurer, not even the treasury, but the treasurer today or something, like this routine business office. And it's a very nice building. Has a kind of like jet design because it was made to be an airplane company office at first. But, no one ever thought of it as a historic place. In fact, no protesters are there at the beginning. No one's thinking about protesting there. They're in Red Square, and they're being pinned in by tanks as they're protesting. Very small group, too. Yeltsin goes to the Russian White House, and he does end up becoming a form of a prisoner there because he won't leave for the next few days.
So how does so let's just set this in time. So the Berlin Wall falls in 89. This is 91 when the coup attempt happens. The Soviet Union does not dissolve from this, how does the coup actually come to an end? How do they end up getting out of this jam, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and everybody who was sort of like, let's keep the union going together?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is because, again, it's a 6-part series and there's so much. So I have 2 episodes on day 1. That's the Monday when people wake up and hear on the radio that there's a new government. You know, in Soviet fashion, you get a variety of reactions. Some people are like, good. That Gorbachev guy finally they'll do something. Bread on the shelves, you know.
Yeah, Swan Lake is playing, and
they play Swan Lake.
There's one thing in there where you were talking about how there was a journalist who was upset that he hadn't been shut down the day of the morning of the coup. Yes, there's a newspaper I believe it's Investia. They're upset. They're not shut down, and in fact, the printers then are the ones that end up saying, "We'll refuse to print this paper if we're not allowed to say everything we want."
It's like there's one comedian who has puppets that I won't name who's like, "I'm doing the uncanceled tour. I haven't been canceled yet. Please cancel me, please, dear God. I need the social proof."
Absolutely, because some of the players, certainly Yeltsin is the ultimate canceled person, right? That comes out of this crisis, you know, as a hero and a leader of a government after that. Where if he had to stand up on his own merits and run as a candidate and explain how well he would do and stuff, it might have been a little tougher.
Sort of like kicking 2 legislators out of a legislature, and then all of a sudden they're going to be congrnow.
We never learned. Heroes. They created some heroes, no doubt. I mean, a similar thing. Now think about that and take Tennessee and put it into the Soviet Union, where people cannot trust any information they get. I know it's true here too, but we have so many sources, podcasts and Twitter and things and people and things like that. But think about it, where people aren't free to speak in broad ways. You know, they're Soviet Union's like not North Korea. That's a great line to draw. They're free to speak in their kitchens. They're free to speak in rooms. They're even starting to do a little more outside as you get to 89. You have certain clubs and groups and things. There's a memorial group that's going to start to talk about the Gulag prior to this coup. They start up during the Perestroika period, which is really after 86, when Gorbachev launches his Perestroika and Glasnost reforms. So you really do have and that's what's seen in this coup and why it unravels. Because if they were North Korea, some of the actions that unraveled what the coup leaders did, they just would have shot a person or two and taken care of it. And there was some fear of that. It wasn't like that wasn't on people's minds. Kryuchkov later, when he's the leader of this August 1991 coup, when he's interviewed, he has no regrets, and he said, if I ever did it again, I would have detained Yeltsin. I didn't say I'd shoot him or anything, but I'd detain him. I would have detained many other people, and we would have isolated the opposition better. And that's really what they don't do. Kryuchkov, incidentally, becomes trusted. He's the boss of Putin during the time we're speaking. Well, not directly, because officially Putin had quit the KGB, but there's also a theory that you never quit the KGB. So
yeah, wasn't he a taxi driver maybe in St. Petersburg?
He had to do a lot of things. He had to do a lot of things, yes, for a short period to work. But there was always this feeling that he all of a sudden got this government job in St. Petersburg, and people who had worked in the municipality and everything were, who is this man behind the desk? And others were like, he's the KGB guy. You have to have one in every town. And he was doing all the foreign dealings. So he was dealing with getting food from Germany to the St. Petersburg government, which Perestroika had released to some of those type of responsibilities to the localities. And so Putin's in charge of that. There's definitely some stories of missing money. We could do a whole podcast on
control the food. You control everything. We'll talk about Putin in a moment, but So the coup fails, but how much longer does the Soviet Union last?
Just the rest of the year. The coup fails to quickly deal with it, just because the biggest mistake they make is that they allow the television to show Yeltsin on a tank. They allow a reporter to give information. on the, even though it's only a few minutes that they're allowed, they're free enough to allow a little bit of discussion. And there's some, between the Gang of Eight, these coup plotters, they're all a bunch of lieutenants. They lose the confidence of a lot of the people below them.
It was almost immediately, wasn't that speech on the announcement the vice president gave was just terrible. And
well, the shaking hands, his hands are trembling during the press conference. So that's one thing they point to. There's also a reporter who gets up who's not supposed to be there. She sneaks through and she asks a question like, isn't what you're doing close to Pinochet? Which in the, they flip out, but it brings it up, and then other reporters start asking questions, and they just didn't control the press conference well. And all of these things add up. You know what, though? They still probably could have cleaned up if they were a little more organized and stormed the White House, and they just never do.
For what it sounded like to me when I was listening, if they had a little bit more resolve, or let's say we're in it, we're going to go the whole way. It's like they kept trying to write a line or keep it pulled back a little bit, thinking that it would fall their way.
I think it's important for understanding the Soviet Union. And if you're like a fan of the TV show Americans, he kind of Weisberg tries to show some of this, that, it wasn't North Korea. I mean, these people, there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of discussion, but it had a structure of, there was still this structure that was not democracy totally either. And I don't think they wanted bloodshed. And I think that was it. They weren't, for instance, like the CCP in Tiananmen Square. That was just like shut it down. Although I will tell you, Khrushchev later felt that he should have been, and he felt that he could have starved out the Russian White House. But they don't. And eventually the coup plotters fail, and they realize they're going to get arrested, and they go to Gorbachev to try to beg his forgiveness. He throws them out, and then they're all locked up, and the rest is... And then, to your point, it's just the rest of the year that the Soviet Union lasts, but it's always pretty much known that something's going to happen here. Gorbachev thinks, like, this is great. I'm going to be the leader of a freer Soviet Union or something, implement more programs. I mean, just incidentally, he died last year, Gorbachev. And one of his last interviews, he's like, I just wish I would have given people put more bread in the budget. Like, never, always the bureaucrat. That's really...
If I just push this lever, this thing will happen the right way, as opposed to human events being disorganized.
One of the highlights.
Really, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the highlights of your telling of that situation is the race of the planes to get to Gorbachev, right? Who gets there first?
Yeah, there's 3 planes. So because it's true, once the coup plotters decide that they're giving, and it's not they're disagreeing with each other, but the defense minister Yazov decides, I'm going to Gorbachev. I know what the inside of a prison's like. I don't want it. Even in the vegetarian days, you're still going to have to sit in a prison that's not friendly. And he flies out. Khrushchev's like, well, you're not going without me, so I'm going with you. They're in a plane. Then the Russians, not Yeltsin, he's still at the White House, but his vice president, Rutskoy, goes in a plane. And then the speaker of the Supreme Soviet, this is a side that we don't, it's forgotten about because now it's just antique Sovietdom or whatever. But the Supreme Soviet's kind of like a mixture of the court and Congress. They should have ruled during this time. Because they kept saying Gorbachev's ill. And if Gorbachev's ill, well, the Supreme Soviet's the one in the Constitution that's supposed to do something. But he doesn't schedule a meeting till the next Monday, giving the coup plotters a full week. So everyone knows he's in it. So he flies out to try to tell Gorbachev, I wasn't in it. So you have this kind of dueling planes thing, and you could make a movie. It'll be like, something like that. But obviously, the coup plotters get there first and also block the Russian deputies' planes so that the Russian government guys can't get there. But when they get there, Gorbachev throws them out and then clears the airfield, brings the Russians in, and then goes home with them, with Khrushchev in chains so that they don't shoot the plane down. So it's only about the rest of the year that it takes to unravel the Soviet Union. But as I talk about in the podcast, I feel like it's really almost 2 days, because after the coup is resolved, it's the interactions between Yeltsin and Gorbachev that happen. And one of them is that Gorbachev starts reinstating people, and Yeltsin tells him, these people you're putting back in power were part of the coup. That's the deputy of the guy that you just arrested. And Gorbachev would say, like, oh, I'll have to look into that. I don't have the power to fire him. And Yeltsin's like, I'm not leaving your office until you do. And I said, like, in that conversation, the Soviet Union ended and it became Russia. I mean, more or less. It just, the rest of it was just watching the sparks. Gorbachev, who was never popular, gains a little popularity for being a martyr, loses a lot of it in the next couple of days because he just won't implement reforms fast enough that people want. And it is now documented that the Communist Party was involved in the coup and did nothing. And Gorbachev will not get rid of leaders of the Communist Party or ban the Communist Party. He calls it a witch hunt. Yeltsin calls him out on it very publicly. And it makes Gorbachev look like which some people suspect. Some people still suspect to this day. I don't, but it's possible that Gorbachev was part of the coup, that knew about it at least. I figure, Gorbachev was a dancer. He could read situations. Maybe he said, let me sit here and see what happens. But in any case, he loses a lot of his political power. And by December of 1991, he's forced to abdicate in effect and end the Soviet Union. And it becomes a weaker CIS, which is Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and all of these countries that are just in a defense cooperation. And then you have events later that will figure out, like the Ukraine gives its nuclear warheads over to control of Russia, things like that.
Yeah, 1993, Bill Clinton forces the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for a protection pact, which was reminded of a lot. Zelensky kept pointing that out. And
I mean, to be fair, the goal here was we wanted to get it to a few countries that had nuclear weapons. I don't think it ever worked.
They didn't want it I mean, Ukraine is corrupt, has always been corrupt. Zelensky was about to be impeached for corruption right before the invasion. Every single government since 1993 has had some major level of corruption. I mean, that's just the nature of these former USSR countries. They once they declared their independence and started walking away from Russia, it was sort of, you had bipolar influences between, the West and NATO and the Russian Federation and wanting to rebuild that. And that is really kind of still going on. That's what's influencing Ukraine now. Can you talk a little bit about what happens after the Soviet Union falls and then this competition? I mean, we here are not the type of libertarians that just say it's all NATO's fault. The reason NATO was expanded was because of Yeltsin and Putin's prosecution of Chechnya, which wanted to break away, and Yeltsin said no, and they went in and committed atrocities, and then all these former Warsaw Pact countries went, ooh, I don't want that. Let's go join NATO. But then, that tit for tat of constant mistakes between the two, the West and Russia, in these Warsaw Pact states, which are, think, Ukraine, Belarus, up to Estonia, just kind of the buffer between Germany and Russia, have been up for grabs since 1993, 1992.
I mean, there's so much there. And another thing I'll throw in just on that point before you lose sight of it is Iraq. I mean, Iraq is I don't even think at the time I thought about this angle, because we weren't thinking about Russia when we were thinking about Saddam Hussein, right? At that time, I was thinking like, God, I hope they don't launch this invasion in 2003, to be quite honest with you. I was not a fan. Didn't seem, 2001 Afghanistan, I was right there with everybody. I kind of wanted to be more covert ops and get bin Laden, etc. Like I thought we were having a lot of success with in 2001, but then shifting over to Iraq, I never thought about the impact on Vladimir Putin or Russia. And that's where that's about as close as I get to his point of view on things. Like, okay, I could understand that was wrong, guys. Like, should have let you know we were invading a country, right? We were invading your Mexico, like right next to you, kind of thing. Maybe your Guatemala, to be accurate. But, it's certainly, if someone invaded Guatemala, we would want to know about it. In fact, We have a whole doctrine about that. So you get that was the rest of it gets more political and certainly entangled. The thing to talk about after the Soviet Union, I'm glad we were able to touch on it, is that because from the real point of view, we've been talking about a lot of the leaders and the coups and in the top level stuff. For the average Russian citizen, the fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster, and it was devastating. They lost the amount of wealth, just savings that was wiped out because they had a horrific inflation and needed to spend real assets on bread. About the only thing that they were able to keep in most cases was their flat, because it's kind of a state arrangement. So you have this flat, and in some cases you have to rent it out. The family that may have never rented their flat out before, if they had a nice Moscow apartment, now has to rent a room because there's just no money to pay for food. Food is used to be the cheapest thing in the Soviet Union, and now is the most expensive. Although it was always expensive for good solid food. So this disaster happens, and because you released all of the societal obligations and pensions and at least reduced all of that and made it ridiculous through inflation. Yeah. And then jacked up prices.
Let me just interject, national divorce people, pay attention. But there's a great book called Who Lost Russia by Peter Conradi. It's really good, and it talks a lot about how the Americans in the West actually are the reason that they made it, because we propped up Yeltsin and gave the Russian government tons of money. And then sometimes we wouldn't give them the promised aid, either monetarily, and then sometimes not even some of the humanitarian aid. But we were feeding Russia and some of these former states for a long time. And the debate in Russia in the Yeltsin years was how close to get to the West. And there were a lot of people who were very anti-Western, obviously. They had been part of that forever, but that, there were a lot of people in Russia who had a lot of goodwill, but I don't think you can stress the importance of how broke and poor the Russians were after the Soviet Union fell, and the hit to their national pride that was taken by having to accept aid from their former enemies, which I think plays a huge part into Putin's swagger coming along and creating several scenarios to help himself get elected. Masha Gessen's couple books, The Man Without the Face, is a great one on the rise of Putin and kind of what happened. Gary Kasparov is really prescient. I mean, really, when you look at his book, The Winter Is Coming. But let's talk about Putin and how he comes to, we can start in 1989 with a KGB agent in East Russia or East Germany losing his mind, and how that plays into his psychology and sort of how he develops.
I think you have to understand that East Germany was like their model. They thought it was like, I guess, like here depending on your perspective on politics, like there's some people here that talk about Sweden a lot of times. Some people look at Israel like as what's your favorite country, that example. And for them, East Germany, a lot of the hardliners in the Soviet Union looked at how well, my God, they can actually listen to everybody's phone calls. We don't have that here yet. The great KGB doesn't have that ability. We can do it at a pinch for an individual, but they have it. They can just listen to any citizen. So Putin was living his dream for a KGB agent to be in East Germany, and watching when that nation, when the wall came down, people went right after the secret police, the Stasi. And many of them were sources and friends for KGB. And Gorbachev, in their view, did nothing to stop it. So they were very, very concerned. And that really drives him. I don't think, the other thing to consider is that Putin's East German assignment puts him out of the Soviet Union during the time of perestroika, and makes it so he's not seeing a lot of the changes and the discussions happening in the street. I don't know how much that would have influenced him anyway. So he's coming back right as, and joining the St. Petersburg government, allegedly a Democrat, but we think still part of the KGB apparatus. because the Soviet Union is so, and because the situation for the average Russian is so difficult, and also there's a lot of crime and instability. You want market share with you have the freedom to start a company in Russia, but you have market share. If you want market share, you go blow up, throw a grenade in your opponent's office. Now, that's not free market. I mean, because that really, for a libertarian show, it's a good thing to note. Like, we can talk about how it's so much better that they left the Soviet Union. I could go on and on with so many examples. It really is real. In case anybody's wondering, like, Soviet Union system really was bad for a lot of reasons. You don't want to do that. Okay, I could spend hours on that. We won't. But when it opened up free market, it's also not cool to like just let prices go crazy on people who are not used to that. And then also the crime, which creates an instability that is also part of not having a free market.
Not just that, but Yeltsin doling out all the state assets, which the state owned all the means of production, and then he doles it out to friends, which it just enables Putin to do the same thing. And then when he comes to power, he immediately starts taking over the largest oil company and putting people in their place. I think when Putin comes to power, there is some hope that he is sort of like Yeltsin. Yeltsin built in 8 years a lot of democratic institutions and was a Democrat at heart, even though he was a deeply corrupt person and a flawed person with his drinking. But it took Yeltsin. I mean, this is one thing I think we have to keep in mind and maybe we'll end on this. It took Putin the better part of 20 years to erode those democratic reforms that were built in 8. And so everybody who thinks that the sky is falling, democracy is dying in darkness, that it's all over here in America, it's going to be a little bit harder to have America fall than one might think. It's probably not as perilous, but I think you also can look at this example and go, okay, you get the right circumstances after a couple decades of corruption and hits to institutions and their people's belief in these institutions, and you have one bad week and it can all be over. I mean, what parallels do you think that Americans can take from the story that you tell in this narrative?
Well, they'd made a huge mistake, which is maybe more in the Russian culture of, there's a TV show on about a KGB agent that saved the Soviet Union that was very popular right as, Putin is coming to power. And they liked in that chaos that they had, they liked a KGB agent, really. One of his key supporters, the former mayor of said that Putin will be a new Stalin. And there's no joke. That's not for funny. That was actually a good slogan. It wasn't the official campaign slogan of Putin, but he's also running against people that probably would have done worse. So that's part of the issue too. And what I've really realized doing this, it doesn't matter if it's left. It doesn't matter if it's right. It doesn't matter if you call yourself communist, if you call yourself fascist, if you say you're pure, you're nationalist, you're Chilean, bringing back Chilean history, or you're bringing back things for the working man, whatever you're going to make statues of, whatever idols you're going to have. Once you lose democracy, it's the same thing. There are some variants. We talked about North Korea. We talked about the Soviet Union versus that, and then there's things like East Germany, where I feel the Stasi was worse. You talk about the Argentine junta, Pinochet, or all various forms of how good and effective they are at totalitarianism. But the fact is, once you lose free press, freedom of association to form clubs, very important. I'll throw in religion, although you got to watch, religious groups sometimes, even in the Soviet and now in the Russian, can help the state in some ways. Just freedom to think if you want to be about religion or not, fine. But freedom to associate, freedom to redress your government. The minute you lose it, you don't really have the ability to listen to people. The problem in America is too many damn people to listen to, including myself. But, once you lose that, it's everything. And it doesn't matter what the people call themselves, or this is a nice dictator. This is a dictator that's designed to make working standards better or something, or to worship the peasant. It doesn't, or people that are just like, hey, we got the guns and we're taking it. for the average person, it doesn't seem to matter much. You have to maintain your free speech, your free association, your checks and balances in government, your judicial system, very important. Soviet Union had one, but again, controlled by the other anchors of power. So all these things are important. And with Putin, I think there might have been I think economically, people in Russia were catching up by about 2000, and things were getting better there. And then the first few years of Putin, I think there were some early signals of what he was going to do, but people were still feeling free. They were starting blogs. You know, he has this scene. There's this in one of the books I've read, The Red Web, a really good book about the beginnings of the Russian internet and blog system. You know, he has this conversation where we're going to institute a law for you bloggers. And then he magnanimously shuts that law down. No, it's not a good idea. And everyone's like, Putin's great. He's going to allow us to speak free. It doesn't last long. They do other things to it. So you see the road, and we got to watch it. And, you know, and it's just, it's definitely a cautionary tale. I don't want to be cartoonish about Russia or the Soviet Union or make fun of people or insulting to what's a great country, great people, great thought. Some of the best democratic hopes were there in that moment in the Russian White House in 1991. People stood up for democracy, and I wonder if we're as willing to do what those people did in 1991. We should think about that sometimes. But the example is still a cautionary tale.
Another great book is Anne Garrel's Putin Country, which she lived in kind of a rural area of Russia. And it kind of, a lot of it mirrors, you know, now Putin is, I don't know, Trump's pretty skilled, but Putin's just so good at manipulating people in
KGB training.
Oh, it's just,
that's KGB training. They didn't just learn judo.
Yeah. Just the testosterone's off the charts with this guy. Reinhold, go ahead. Final wrap it up here.
What I was saying is that what I got out of this too was the things that kind of got bad after the coup and the fall started happening, and then the reforms that were being put in weren't working, right? So people, like we had talked before about how Americans don't think about this. We get mad when we go to the store and eggs are $5 a dozen, and they were paying like what $25, $30. I mean, if they could get them, right? So things were really rough, and a lot of people in kind of our sphere will try to say we want to collapse the economy and everything so we can build it up and be more free. But that rarely ever happens. What we see here is I think that the people were looking for a firmer hand on the government to make things stable again, to make things less chaotic, to make things easier for them. So they're more willing to go back to a new Stalin of sorts. Like, we want Stalin, but without all the death camps and everything else. But they want a firm hand, I think.
They want a firm hand. Milton Friedman said once that I don't have any constituency. And I don't think he's ever been proven wrong. And I don't think you ever have an absolute free market. You only get a free market on certain occasions, like you start scaling down regulations when people want a quick boost in the economy or something. And I think actually that was the dream that they had in Russia. And they probably should have done it a lot slower, even during the Gorbachev period, than they were doing. But there was all these politics behind it. But I also think there was this, we're going to get this big boost in the economy. No one really, most people do when the minute the economy gets bad or prices go up, they want some kind of control. So I don't know that like free market systems are popular per se. They're just like, doing the most towards that end is we think is right. I mean, the cautionary tale, you don't want people like, well, look, the Soviet Union had a free market because it developed this hundreds of billions dollar black market. The rival of any country in 1989, any GDP in 1989 would be the Soviet black market. But you don't want that. You don't want that extra cost and people having to risk arrest to buy something. But it is true. The average American, I tend to think it's like they actually want things taken care of for them. And if the free market thing gets too out of hand, look at the stock market, always linking up stock markets to presidents. What do they have to do with that? They got nothing to do with the stock market. Anyway,
I just saw some major, but we're never going to get through this crisis if we don't have price controls on a global level. I'm like, okay. Weeps and Thomas Sowell. All right, Bruce, tell us how we can find the podcast, where we can find the podcast, and listen to the series.
Sure. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. It's My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. You can find it on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, wherever you get podcasts. It is one of the more recent. I only have a couple of episodes more recent than the 6-part USSR series, Fall of USSR. Also, there's an extra notebook. There was so much in the series, I had a whole full notebook to talk about in a 7th episode that we added recently. So, if you have a long car ride, hey, I'd be honored.
All right. Thanks so much, Bruce. We really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Reinhold.
Thanks, Reinhold, for setting this up. And thank you, listener, for tuning in. We ask that you go support Bruce. Check out his podcast. If you liked this, if you learned something, the best thing you can do for any creator that you like, short of giving them money, is to share their work and say thank you. I really enjoyed this, and spread the word of mouth. That's how you can support us. That's how you can support Bruce. And like I said, everybody else that you like. All right. Thanks so much. We will see you again here on The Chris Spangle Show.